Good to be with you this morning. I was just telling Pastor Aaron I always dreamed of having like walk-up music when I get up to preach. I don't know if I would have picked Casting Crowns, but it's a good start, so we'll see where we can go from there. But if you were here last Sunday, you know that I struggled to get through our graduation moment a little bit. I got a little bit emotional with that send-off and realizing that was the end of our seniors last Sunday. So thank you for sticking around and celebrating them. It was a good time, good celebration. And someone came up to me after the service and they said, you know, you're preaching next Sunday, right? You know, they saw all the waterworks I had and they're like, you think you can make it through 25 minutes? You're going to be okay next week? So I'll do my best, no promises this morning. But if you've been with us the last several weeks, you know that we are in the middle of a series called The I Am Statements of Jesus. And so far we've taken a look at Jesus saying that he is the bread of life and that he is the light of the world, that he is the gate. And then last week we just looked at Jesus saying that he is the good shepherd. And it's in these statements that we get a little bit of a clearer picture of who Jesus is and then how we then can respond and how we are to live in response to who Jesus says that he is. And so today we are continuing the series by taking a look at John chapter 11 when Jesus declares that he is the resurrection and the life. And before we get to our passage this morning, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the context in which these words that we are about to read take place. In the context in which Jesus says something so bold as, I am the resurrection and the life. Because we are, many of us, Christ followers, and we've been Christ followers for a long time. We've been in the church for a long time. And so when we hear Jesus is the resurrection and the life, we think, well, of course he is. Of course Jesus is the resurrection. But if we aren't used to hearing those words, they are strange. It is strange that someone would say that they themselves are resurrection. They themselves are life. And so what Jesus says to us this morning in the passage we are about to read is either absolutely crazy or has the power to change everything. And so, like I said, the context of what we are about to read is really important. The passage leading up to what we are going to read this morning, we are told there that Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus is sick. And Jesus is really good friends with Lazarus. And so they send word to Jesus to tell him that Lazarus is not doing well. And we're not really told exactly what their expectations are when they pass this news along to Jesus. But as we get into our story, we kind of get the understanding that they expected that there was at least a chance that Jesus could heal Lazarus. They had hoped that that may happen. And after all, Mary and Martha would have known, at least by now, that Jesus had healed many people. Many times they were strangers, and so it would make sense that they would expect that Jesus would want to heal his best friend, a close friend, and not just strangers as well. But before we get into this, we have to realize that before Jesus gets to Lazarus, he passes. And that's where we're going to pick up our story this morning. And so if you're able, I want to invite you to stand with me as we read the good news of Jesus from John chapter 11. This is John 11, 17 through 27. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was a little less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Many Jews had come to comfort Martha and Mary after their brother's death. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him while Mary remained in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask God, God will give you. Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Martha replied, I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She replied, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, God's Son, the one who is coming into the world. This is the word of God for the people of God. You may be seated this morning. So I have to admit this morning that there are some subjects that a pastor gets a little bit more excited to preach about than other passages or other subjects. I was going through my computer this week and I stumbled upon some old documents and I found I had to do a presentation in college towards the end of my master's degree. It was a 20-minute presentation on the historicity of the book of Deuteronomy. And I had to give this presentation at 8 a.m. In a class to a bunch of my peers. And I remember, as I found this document, not being super excited to have to present that to my peers and maintain their interest at 8 o'clock in the morning when they would rather be sleeping. But I can honestly say this morning that I am really excited to share with you from this passage of Scripture for a couple of reasons. But first, obviously, because Christians believe that the resurrection is an incredible moment for us. It is something that we believe changes everything and everyone. But the second reason this morning is a little bit more personal. It's because this resurrection, this thing that is supposed to be such good news for us, was something that was a really big barrier for me when I was younger, as a teenager. I had a really hard time making sense of the resurrection. I remember as a junior in high school reading books like The Case for Christ, trying to figure out how to make rational and logical sense out of my Christian faith. I really struggled to believe things like the virgin birth and miracles, but more than anything else, the resurrection was something I struggled with. I didn't see how it made any sense that someone could come back from the dead. And I know that I'm not the only person who's had these questions. It was about a year or so ago, we did a study in youth group on Wednesday nights about doubt. And so I asked our students to fill out cards and write down some of the things that they wrestle with and that they struggle with. And so I would say half of the comment cards that we got back probably had something about the resurrection written on them. These questions that we have trying to understand what is happening in the resurrection. And so I struggled with this, and I know our students have had questions, and I know many of us have had these same questions. And it's a good thing for us to think about these things because the resurrection is such a big part of our faith. In fact, it is the story of our faith. Christianity openly admits that if Jesus was not raised from the dead, that our faith is meaningless. It's kind of important. How many of you have ever been to the Cathedral Basilica in St. Louis? I get a show of hands this morning. All right. Many of you, good. If you haven't been, you need to go. It's an awesome combination of faith and history and beautiful artwork. And so I have a picture this morning, and you're not going to be able to read that. There's no way. But if you could, in that side dome, it reads at the bottom, "If Christ has not risen, your faith is vain." And so I love that. I think it speaks to the importance of the resurrection. But depending on where you're standing in the cathedral, the phrase changes a little bit. Has anybody noticed that when they've been there? No? I'm just the weird, twisted person that, okay, good. This is going to be good this morning then. Okay, if you move to your left a little bit, if you're looking at this picture, the word "if" slowly disappears. So it then reads, "Christ is not risen, your faith is vain." All right? Which is kind of problematic. That's not what you want to read. But then if you move all the way up to the altar and to the lectern at the front of the cathedral, it simply reads, "Your faith is vain." And I think we have another slide for that as well this morning. Yeah, so there's a mosaic fail that just says your faith is vain. And so I can just picture these people that have been working on this beautiful piece of art for years and years, coming down from the scaffolding or however they worked on these ceilings and getting down and just going, oh, like not realizing what it was going to say depending on where you were in the cathedral. And actually, from this vantage point, this is almost exactly where the priest would be standing as he delivers the homily every week. And so I can imagine, as a pastor, the thing that you don't want to be reading as you're preaching week after week is "your faith is vain." And so a little bit of a mosaic fail for you this morning. But I love the words that were supposed to be read in this mosaic, and the words that are echoed then from 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ is not risen, your faith is vain. And so this idea of resurrection, as crazy and as otherworldly as it may seem, is so central to our faith. And so as we continue into the story this morning, my hope is that we will discover why it matters for us and why it matters for us now. I'm glad we took that down because that's a little bit discouraging. I don't want to see that for the rest of the morning while I'm up here. But what I love about our passage this morning is that not only are we told that Jesus himself is the resurrection and the life, but we're also told a story in which someone is wrestling with the idea of resurrection, these same questions that we have had. They want to know how the resurrection works and what it means and what the power of the resurrection means for us where we are now. In our story, we meet Mary and Martha, who are mourning the loss of their brother, and Jesus assures them that Lazarus will rise again. And Martha tells Jesus, I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. And so I want to pause here for just a second this morning because it's really important that we understand that the people of Israel have always believed in a resurrection of the dead. This was the predominant view. Most people held to this, except for the Sadducees. The Sadducees were kind of the exception here. They didn't believe in a resurrection. In fact, they didn't believe in any kind of an afterlife at all. And so that is why many people say that the Sadducees were so sad, you see. Some of you are saying it for me. You've heard this before. That's like the most overused preacher's joke ever. It's really, really bad, but you will all remember that the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. But outside of the Sadducees, the majority of Jews embraced this idea of resurrection. They believed that on the last day, God would raise the dead for judgment and for justice. And so when Jesus assures Martha that Lazarus will rise again, this is not something that would surprise her. She absolutely would have believed and had hope that Lazarus would be raised eventually. But this resurrection that they believed in was an event that would happen in the future. And so the resurrection was a distant hope that would happen someday. But Jesus' next words to Martha are absolutely huge for us this morning, and they are the focus for us today. This is verse 25. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. And so it's in this moment that Jesus declares that he himself is the resurrection and the life. And so Jesus, as he always seems to do, he challenges not only Martha's understanding of things, but the majority of Jewish tradition as well. Jesus takes this hope of the resurrection that they have always understood as a future event that was a long way off, and he completely redescribes it. Not as an event, but as a person. And he says that it is in this person, in himself, in Jesus, that this future event was breaking into their present. In just a little while, I guess it's about 6 weeks away, our students will be getting on a plane in St. Louis to go to NYC 2019. And I'm really excited about that. I'm so glad that 9 of our students are going to get to have that experience this summer. And so I just want to encourage you to be praying, as we've already talked this morning, for those students who are going, that the Lord will work before, during, and after that event. And I really do think it's a life-changing opportunity. But I mentioned NYC this morning, not just to give you one more commercial, but because I want to talk about NYC 2015 for just a second. Because we went to Louisville in 2015, and it was another great week of teaching and worship and service together. But that week will always have a little bit extra meaning to me personally, because it was during NYC 2015 that Morgan made the 4-hour drive to Louisville to tell me that she was pregnant with Owen. And so that was a fun moment for us. It was an exciting time for us. But it was in that moment that a future event broke into our present, because we had talked about what it would be like to be parents, and we were excited about that possibility. But at least for me, it was in that moment that it became real, and that in less than 9 months, this was going to be our reality. And so I remember how excited and both how terrified I was that this was actually happening. And suddenly this news of Owen's future birth became part of our everyday life and our normal conversation. And we started to have the most important conversations about, you have to paint the nursery and you have to pick baby names and all these kinds of things. You're reading parenting books maybe a little bit, or at least Morgan was reading them and I was purchasing them. That's kind of how that worked out in our house. I still have a stack next to my bed that I need to be reading, and I really do need to be reading them. But we even attended a birthing class together, to be prepared and know exactly what to expect in these kinds of things. And I can tell you that there is nothing that fully prepares you for that moment at all. I remember about a half hour after Owen was born, one of the nurses came up to me and they were like, hey, if you need to sit down, if you feel like you're going to pass out, that's fine. And I was like, honestly, like if I was going to pass out, I would have done it a long time ago. But they do everything, the Owen comes along and they do the APGAR test just to make sure everything is as it needs to be and checking vitals and stuff. And I was kind of nervous, because I didn't know what to expect. And they were like, oh, like it's great. He scored super high. And I'm like, well, why is he purple? Like this is first time I've ever experienced this. This cannot be normal. So just goes to show you there is nothing that can fully prepare you for what you are going to experience in that moment. But Owen wasn't born until March, but it was at NYC 2015 in Louisville that moment began to break into our present and began to change our plans for the future. And every analogy breaks down, and one of my challenges this week, there is nothing that you can say as an analogy to what God does in the resurrection that is accurate. But what is so radical about our passage this morning isn't that Jesus teaches that there will be a resurrection. Martha knew that. Israel knew that. The crazy thing that we read this morning is that Jesus says that he himself is the resurrection and he is the life, and that the hope that Israel had always expected, but that was always an event that was off in the future, had broken into their present in the person of Jesus. And I don't want to ruin the rest of the story for you this morning, the rest of the story of Lazarus, so spoiler alert here, okay? Pause, opportunity to cover your ears. But Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, okay? That is the end of the story. So that's another sermon for another time that I don't have time to fully get into. Marvel gave everybody 2 weeks before they gave out spoilers, so I figured you guys have had a lot longer to read the story of Lazarus if you don't know that that's how it ends. But the really good news for us this morning is that what Jesus did for Lazarus, just several weeks later, he himself did when he resurrected from the dead. He did that for us, for all. And again, the hope of the resurrection that was supposed to be an end event broke into the present. But this time it wasn't just for Lazarus. It was for all people of all times and all places. And in Jesus, we discovered that God is a God of life and a God who brings things back from the dead. And the crazy thing is that we shouldn't be surprised by this. We shouldn't be surprised of Jesus telling us that he is life, because God has always been a God who brings life to broken and seemingly dead situations. We see this throughout the New Testament as we read it for sure, but if we read in the Old Testament, we see plenty of examples of God working to bring life. We know the story in Ezekiel about dry bones and God giving them life to live again. And so if you're looking for some great scripture to read Ezekiel 37. It's a powerful passage that you may not stumble upon in Ezekiel. We know the stories of God bringing the people of Israel back from exile and their rescue from Egypt, because God has always been a God who brings life to dead and broken situations. And so as I was thinking about this passage this week and what it means for us, and I began to think about how it impacts us and how it comes to us today, I began to think that we have a lot in common with Martha in this story. Because just like Martha, I think we know that the resurrection is good news for us eventually. We know that we can celebrate that someday, that eventually we have hope that we will enter into eternity with Jesus. And as followers of Christ, we have a lot of hope because we believe what will happen in the end when Christ returns or when he calls us home. And we should be really excited about that time that is coming. Because when Christ returns, the dead will be raised. Christ will be king, and all that has been wrong will be made right. All the injustices that have happened throughout history will be brought to justice. And so that's some really good news and something we should hold to in our faith. But what I want us to hear this morning, what I want to preach for us today, that I think is so important for us and was so important for Martha, is that the hope of the resurrection isn't just for someday. It's for today. I was reading a book by Andrew Root this week, and he's one of my favorite authors that combines theology and youth ministry, and he said this about the resurrection. Resurrection isn't something that Jesus does, nor is it something that God does through Jesus. Resurrection is something that Jesus is. is the core of Jesus' very being. Jesus is the fullness of life come to humanity. And so this morning we believe that Jesus brings life wherever he shows up, because it's who he is. We absolutely believe that at the end, Jesus will bring life and resurrection to the world, but we also believe that that future hope breaks into our now. And as people who know Jesus, we get to experience life with Christ now. And so for us this morning, as we conclude today, and as we're in just a few minutes, we're going to have a chance just to respond and sing together. I want us to remember that Jesus is resurrection and Jesus is life. I want us to remember the times in our life when God has brought life to us in the midst of our broken situations. I want us to remember the times when God has brought resurrection to our relationships and to our homes. Because as I was thinking about this passage this week, I knew that we'd be reading a story about how God brings life to our current situations. But many of us don't have to read this story to know that it's true, because we've lived it. We've experienced God's faithfulness to bring life in the midst of our greatest struggles. And so this morning, as we wrap up here, I just want us to reflect on the faithfulness of God and the times that he has shown up when we needed him the most, and he's been resurrection for us. But this morning, I also want us to consider what parts of our life Jesus might want to bring back to life. Because we all have these areas in our life, and sometimes they are areas of our life that seem hopeless. We all have things and situations and relationships that, if we are being honest, we don't have much hope for. We all have things that need new life, but we don't always know if that new life is possible. But this morning, if Jesus is teaching us anything in this passage, we need to hear that where Jesus is, we should expect life. And we should expect people and things that are lifeless and hopeless and too far gone to come back to life. Because life is who Jesus is. And life is what Jesus provides.